In 1948, a Brazilian surveying team disappeared for 6 days in the Javari Valley. When they stumbled back to their river camp, 3 men refused to speak about what they'd seen in the flooded forest. The fourth described a serpent so massive it had displaced the water level of an entire oxbow lake when it submerged. His colleagues dismissed his account as fever dreams. But the Matse's people who guided them back simply nodded. They called that region the place where the Great Mother sleeps. The Amazon harbors over 400 billion trees across 2.1 million square miles. Satellite imagery penetrates only the uppermost canopy layer, revealing nothing of what moves through the perpetual twilight beneath. Modern herpetology recognizes the green anaconda as the world's heaviest snake, with confirmed specimens reaching 5.2 meters and 97 kilograms. But in the regions where no scientist has ever set foot, where rivers run black as oil and the forest floor hasn't seen direct sunlight in millennia, the rules of documented biology dissolve into something far more uncertain. The largest anaconda ever measured with scientific rigor was a female collected in Venezuela in 1944, stretching 5.21 meters. The Guinness World Record holder, captured in Brazil in 1960, measured 5.54 meters before escaping back into the river. These are the giants we know. But the Amazon contains approximately 16,000 tree species, 1,300 bird species, and countless areas where the density of vegetation makes human passage physically impossible without months of machete work. In such places, what grows, what hunts, what coils in the permanent shadow? These questions remain unanswered, not because science lacks interest, but because the jungle refuses entry. Indigenous knowledge systems spanning millennia describe anacondas, far exceeding modern records. The Yanomami of the Brazil-Venezuela border speak of Yacuna Momoi, the great mother serpent that dwells in the deepest forest pools, a creature requiring the strength of an entire hunting party to drag from the water. The Kayapo describe specimens they call Mokre Kamrek, the one who drinks the river, claiming lengths of 10 arm spans or more. Western anthropologists have documented these accounts for over a century, carefully noting them as cultural mythology. Yet when pressed, the indigenous informants don't present these descriptions as legends. They speak of anacondas they've encountered, snakes their grandfathers helped kill, creatures that required 4 canoes to transport. In 1906, British explorer Percy Fawcett reported shooting an anaconda on the Rio Abuna that measured, by his pacing, over 18 meters. His account was published in the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society, then quietly dismissed by zoologists who found the measurement physically implausible given known reptilian biology. Fawcett's reputation for accuracy in other matters lent uncomfortable weight to the claim. He vanished into the Amazon in 1925, his final expedition consumed by the forest before he could provide further documentation. But rubber tappers working the Acre region in the 1920s reported multiple encounters with anacondas they estimated at 12 to 15 meters, describing confrontations that left men missing, canoes overturned, and scars on survivors that matched the spacing of massive serpentine jaws. Catholic missionaries in the 1700s documented indigenous accounts of sucuris gigantes, giant anacondas, with remarkable consistency across hundreds of kilometers of river systems. Father Samuel Fritz, mapping the Amazon between 1689 and 1723, recorded testimonies from 23 different tribal groups, all describing serpents of extraordinary size dwelling in the most remote tributaries. His journals note that these accounts uniformly placed the largest specimens not in accessible rivers, but in regions he termed impenetrable water forests and endless marshlands where canoes cannot pass. The geographical correlation is striking. The missionaries heard these stories from people separated by vast distances, yet the descriptions aligned. Massive serpents inhabiting the most inaccessible waterways, particularly blackwater tributaries, where the acidic conditions dye the water dark as tea. The anaconda's biology supports extreme size under optimal conditions. As ectothermic predators, they never stop growing throughout their lives. Growth slows after maturity, but continues indefinitely. A female anaconda that survives 30, 40, or 50 years in a prey-rich environment with minimal predation pressure would continue adding length and mass. The limiting factor for documented specimens isn't biological possibility, it's survival. Large anacondas become targets. They're killed by ranchers protecting livestock, by indigenous hunters proving prowess, by fishermen eliminating competitors, by curious humans with rifles. In populated areas, giant anacondas don't live long enough to reach maximum potential size. But in regions where humans never go, where the forest creates absolute barriers to human entry, selection pressure disappears. Consider the Javari Valley Indigenous Territory, a protected area spanning 85,000 square kilometers along the Brazil-Peru border. It contains at least 14 uncontacted indigenous groups who have violently rejected all outside interaction. Brazilian FUNAI agents monitoring the territory's borders report hearing accounts from the contacted Matses people of anacondas in the deep interior that, in their language, swallow whole the pig-sized game animals without stretching. FUNAI's protection mandate means no scientific surveys occur inside these boundaries. Satellite imagery shows nothing but unbroken canopy. The flooded forests that dominate the Javari during the wet season create an aquatic labyrinth where water depth varies from ankle-deep to 10 meters across distances of mere feet, and the submerged forest floor remains in absolute darkness even at midday. The Rio Negro's upper tributaries flow through terrain that has defeated every attempt at systematic biological survey. Blackwater rivers earn their name from tannins leached from decaying vegetation, creating water with visibility measured in centimeters. Unlike the muddy whitewater rivers that dominate the Amazon basin, blackwater systems are nutrient-poor but support specialized ecosystems. The Igarape das Pedras, a tributary so small it appears on no standard map, runs through one of the most species-rich areas on Earth and one of the least documented. The indigenous Baniwa people use its waters, but have oral prohibitions against traveling certain sections, which they describe as where the water mother hunts. Brazilian herpetologists have requested funding for surveys of this region 43 times since 1967. Not one proposal has been funded, primarily because the cost of establishing even temporary research infrastructure in such remote terrain exceeds the budget of most university departments. Anacondas exhibit site fidelity, returning to the same hunting territories, breeding aggregations, and basking sites throughout their lives. A female establishing territory in a truly remote location might never encounter a human, might never face a threat greater than jaguars or caimans, might feed without competition for decades. The largest confirmed specimens have been found in areas recently accessed by researchers, meaning the truly inaccessible regions remain unsampled. When a 5-meter anaconda is discovered, it makes news precisely because it's unusual in accessible areas. But what size do anacondas reach in the 90% of the Amazon that remains biologically unknown? The 2019 discovery of geoglyphs in Acre State, massive earthworks visible only from aircraft, demonstrated how thoroughly the jungle conceals even enormous structures beneath its living ceiling. These geometric formations, some covering 13 hectares, were built by pre-Columbian civilizations and remained unknown to modern science despite existing in areas crossed by roads and occasionally logged. If human constructions on that scale could hide until the 21st century, the suggestion that biological specimens might avoid documentation becomes less implausible. An anaconda doesn't build, it doesn't clear trees. It moves through environments that provide perfect camouflage, hunting in darkness, swimming in water where visibility extends mere inches, existing in a realm that actively conceals. The flooded forest ecosystem, Igapo, creates hunting grounds uniquely suited to massive constrictors. During the wet season, water levels rise 10 to 15 meters, transforming terra firma forest into a vast labyrinth where fish swim between tree trunks and capybaras navigate submerged vegetation. Anacondas hunting in Igapo have access to prey densities impossible in drier environments. Fish, caimans, capybaras, deer, tapirs, all concentrated in shrinking areas of dry ground. A female anaconda establishing territory in a permanent Igapo system fed by blackwater tributaries would have optimal conditions for extreme growth, abundant prey, thermal stability from water, and concealment within a three-dimensional hunting ground where human observers simply cannot go. Modern herpetology relies heavily on mark recapture studies, radio telemetry, and systematic surveys to understand reptile populations. These methods require capturing specimens, attaching tracking devices, and monitoring movements over time. But the methodology breaks down completely in truly remote regions. Radio telemetry requires regular aircraft flights over study areas, impossible in regions where aircraft are prohibited by indigenous protection laws. Mark recapture studies require access to capture sites, impossible when those sites lie beyond 5 days of river travel, followed by forced marches through terrain where a kilometer requires a full day's machete work. The largest anacondas might exist precisely in the locations where studying them is methodologically impossible. The Pico da Neblina National Park, straddling the Brazil-Venezuela border, protects 22,000 square kilometers of cloud forest, lowland rainforest, and savanna. The park's remoteness is legendary. The nearest town lies 180 kilometers away, and the park has no roads, no permanent facilities, and no regular ranger patrols. Biological surveys conducted there in 1984 and 2000 covered less than 0.5% of the park's area. The expedition reports describe terrain so difficult that progress averaged 300 meters per day. Rivers in the region include unnamed blackwater tributaries that appear on no maps, flowing through valleys where the canopy closure exceeds 98%. Indigenous Yanomami communities living on the park's periphery describe anacondas in the interior river systems that, according to anthropologists translating their testimonies, require 20 men to lift when killed. Temperature regulation presents another factor supporting extreme size in remote populations. Anacondas, like all reptiles, depend on external heat sources to maintain optimal body temperature. In the Amazon's shaded waterways, large body mass provides thermoregulatory advantages. A massive anaconda retains heat more efficiently than smaller specimens, allowing it to maintain hunting activity during cooler nights and rainy seasons. The metabolic advantages of large size create a positive feedback loop. Bigger anacondas hunt more efficiently in cool conditions, allowing them to consume more prey, supporting further growth. In regions with stable temperatures and year-round prey availability, the theoretical upper size limit remains unknown. Laboratory studies extrapolating from growth rates in captive specimens suggest that an anaconda living 50 years in optimal conditions could potentially exceed 10 meters and 250 kilograms. No captive anaconda has approached this age, and no wild population study has tracked individuals for more than a decade. The Monte Alegre region of Pará state contains some of the Amazon's oldest rock art, painted over 11,000 years ago by cultures predating known Amazonian civilizations. Among the imagery, enormous serpent figures that, according to archaeologists, were clearly significant to the artists. Some serpent depictions span over 8 meters in length, suggesting the artist either knew of or imagined snakes of extraordinary size. The Palikur people, whose ancestors likely created these paintings, maintain oral traditions of anacondas that hunted the ancestors before the floods came, describing serpents that made the rivers themselves dangerous to cross. While petroglyphs and oral traditions cannot confirm biological facts, they demonstrate that the concept of giant anacondas existed in Amazonian cultures long before European contact, suggesting encounters that left lasting impressions. Prey availability in remote regions offers another piece of the puzzle. Capybaras, the world's largest rodents, thrive in inaccessible wetlands where hunting pressure is absent. Adult capybaras weigh 35 to 65 kilograms, substantial meals for a large constrictor. In protected areas far from human populations, capybara densities can exceed 50 individuals per square kilometer. Add white-lipped peccaries, marsh deer, caimans, and large fish species, and the biomass available to an apex predator becomes substantial. An anaconda growing to extreme size would require enormous caloric intake, but in regions where prey populations remain unnaturally high due to total absence of human hunting, such resources exist. The limiting factor isn't food. It's the ability to consume it before dying of other causes. In areas where those other causes are absent, the equation changes. Venezuelan herpetologist Jesus Rivas, who has studied anacondas for over 3 decades, publicly states that he would not be surprised by reports of 8-meter specimens in remote areas. His caveat, but we will never confirm such specimens without access to those areas, and currently that access does not exist. Rivas has documented wild anacondas reaching 5.4 meters, and notes that the largest specimens his team encounters are invariably females found in the most remote survey locations. Each time funding allows surveys in slightly more inaccessible territory, the maximum recorded size increases incrementally. The pattern suggests that accessibility and maximum recorded size correlate inversely. The harder a location is to reach, the larger the anacondas found there. Extrapolating that pattern to truly inaccessible locations raises uncomfortable questions about what size ceiling actually exists. The Tumucumake Mountains National Park in Amapá State covers 38,000 square kilometers, Brazil's largest national park, and contains terrain so rugged that portions remain unexplored even by satellite-based LiDAR surveys. The park protects the headwaters of dozens of rivers, including several that have never been navigated beyond their first waterfalls. Indigenous Aparai people who live on the park's eastern boundary describe anacondas in the upper river systems that are thick as a man's body through the middle, suggesting diameters exceeding 40 centimeters, far beyond any confirmed measurement. The Aparai have no tradition of exaggeration in their wildlife descriptions. Their accounts of jaguar sizes, tapir weights, and caiman lengths align closely with scientific data. Their anaconda descriptions stand as the sole significant outliers. Satellite thermal imaging, which successfully detects large mammals moving through forest cover, proves ineffective for anacondas. As ectothermic animals, their body temperature matches their surroundings, rendering them thermally invisible. Drones equipped with standard cameras cannot penetrate closed canopy. LiDAR can map forest structure, but cannot identify animals within that structure. The technological tools that have revolutionized wildlife biology in African savannas and North American forests simply don't work in the Amazon's particular combination of dense vegetation, aquatic habitats, and ectothermic fauna. The jungle's defensive properties aren't merely physical, they extend to the electromagnetic spectrum, creating blind spots in our surveillance capabilities. The concept of terra preta, ancient Amazonian dark earth created by pre-Columbian civilizations, demonstrates that massive human populations once thrived in regions we now consider pristine wilderness. These civilizations collapsed after European contact introduced diseases that killed up to 90% of the indigenous population. As human populations crashed and the forest reclaimed cleared land, wildlife populations exploded into the vacuum. Anacondas, freed from human predation pressure, would have experienced population booms and, with abundant prey, grown to sizes never observed during periods of dense human settlement. The Amazon that early 20th century explorers encountered wasn't pristine. It was in the late stages of recovering from human depopulation. The truly remote regions they couldn't reach, those might have been inaccessible even to the pre-Columbian civilizations, representing areas that have never experienced sustained human presence. Modern pharmaceutical research offers a peculiar footnote to the giant anaconda question. In 2016, researchers analyzing anaconda metabolism discovered compounds in their digestive systems that could potentially treat human heart disease. The discovery prompted proposals for systematic surveys of large anacondas in remote populations, hypothesizing that older, larger specimens might yield unique compounds. The Brazilian government received 23 such proposals between 2016 and 2021. 0 were approved for regions within indigenous territories or protected areas with restricted access. The reasoning: concerns about establishing precedent for scientific access to protected lands that might later be exploited for other purposes. So the regions most likely to contain large, old anacondas remain off-limits, even to researchers with purely beneficial intentions. The Marañón River Basin in Peru contains one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, yet systematic surveys have covered less than 15% of its area. The Matses Indigenous Reserve, which spans the Peru-Brazil border in this region, has been studied so minimally that even estimates of basic species counts remain controversial. When herpetologist Giuseppe Gagliardi attempted to survey amphibian populations there in 2008, he reported that the distance between navigable river and accessible forest is measured in hours of fighting through vegetation, and the accessible forest represents perhaps 5% of the total area. His team recorded 6 new species of poison dart frogs in 3 weeks, suggesting the biological richness of what remains undocumented. Anacondas were seen but never captured, leading Gagliardi to note, "We observed what appeared to be an extremely large individual from approximately 40 meters distance before it submerged in a blackwater pool too deep to follow." Indigenous protection laws create a secondary barrier to documentation. Brazil's FUNAI recognizes dozens of uncontacted tribes within the Amazon, and federal law prohibits any non-indigenous entry into their territories without explicit invitation, which by definition cannot come from groups that refuse contact. These territories encompass millions of hectares. Some, like the Kawahiva Indigenous Territory in Mato Grosso, exist as protected areas, specifically because uncontacted groups inhabit them, despite no modern direct contact. The restrictions are ethically sound. Forced contact with isolated tribes historically results in disease transmission and cultural destruction, but the consequence is absolute prohibition on biological surveys. If the largest anacondas exist within these territories, protected by both legal frameworks and indigenous resistance to outsiders, they will remain undocumented indefinitely. Rubber tappers and illegal loggers, people who enter restricted areas despite prohibitions, occasionally surface with accounts that complicate the picture. In 2014, a group of illegal mahogany cutters working in a restricted section of the Serra do Divisa National Park reported abandoning their camp after encountering an anaconda they described as longer than 2 of our trucks. They provided no photographs, and their location meant no verification could occur without revealing their illegal activities. Similar reports surface every few years. Fishermen who release fish traps after finding them occupied by anacondas too large to kill. Poachers who flee rather than confront serpents that weren't supposed to exist. These accounts lack scientific value but demonstrate consistency. People who operate in forbidden areas, who have experience with typical anaconda sizes, report encounters with specimens they consider anomalous. The Amazon's seasonal flood pulse creates temporary habitats that disappear before they can be surveyed. During peak flood season, water levels in some regions rise 15 meters, creating vast temporary lakes and flooded forests that exist for only 4 to 5 months annually. Anacondas move into these areas to hunt, accessing prey concentrations impossible during dry seasons. A truly massive female, requiring enormous caloric intake, might time her hunting cycles to these temporary floods, moving between permanent water bodies and seasonal habitats along routes known only to her. Tracking such movements would require year-round monitoring of areas that are inaccessible by land, navigable by boat for only part of the year, and protected from aircraft surveillance. The methodology to study such a creature simply doesn't exist. Population genetics offers intriguing hints about undiscovered anaconda diversity. A 2019 study analyzing mitochondrial DNA from museum specimens revealed that green anacondas comprise at least 4 distinct genetic lineages, not the 2 subspecies previously recognized. The study's authors noted that sample collection was heavily biased toward accessible populations near rivers with regular boat traffic. Remote populations, particularly those in blackwater tributaries and flooded forests, remain almost entirely unsampled. Genetic diversity typically increases in isolated populations, and the Amazon's geography creates ideal conditions for population fragmentation. Distinct lineages evolving in separate isolated river systems might exhibit different maximum sizes, different behaviors, different habitat preferences. Until remote populations are sampled, the full diversity of Amazonian anacondas remains unknown. The economic realities of Amazonian research create practical barriers independent of biological or geographical challenges. A single 3-week expedition to a moderately remote location costs approximately $50,000 when including boats, fuel, guides, permits, equipment, and researcher salaries. Truly remote locations requiring multiple boats, helicopter support, and extended timeframes can cost $200,000 or more. Grant funding agencies require clear, answerable research questions with predictable outcomes. Survey for giant anacondas in inaccessible regions doesn't meet funding criteria because it cannot promise results. So the surveys don't happen, not because scientists lack interest, but because the infrastructure of academic research cannot support the necessary investment for uncertain outcomes. Climate change adds urgency to the question of what exists in remote regions. As deforestation accelerates and temperature patterns shift, previously stable ecosystems face disruption. Populations that have thrived in isolation for centuries might face rapid habitat loss before they're ever documented. The 2019 Amazon fires burned approximately 906,000 hectares, a catastrophe for biodiversity, but one that exposed previously hidden terrain to aerial surveys. Several previously unknown archaeological sites were discovered. No massive anacondas were documented, but the temporary visibility offered by fires lasts weeks, while anacondas in threatened areas retreat to remaining water sources, becoming even more concentrated and elusive. The race between documentation and destruction tilts heavily toward destruction. Recent technological advances offer tentative hope for surveying previously inaccessible regions. Environmental DNA, eDNA sampling, which detects species presence through genetic material they shed into water, can identify anaconda populations without seeing the animals themselves. A 2021 pilot study in the Cuyabeno Reserve in Ecuador used eDNA to detect anacondas in tributaries too small to navigate by boat. The technique cannot determine size, but it can confirm presence. If applied systematically to remote blackwater tributaries currently considered too difficult to survey, eDNA might reveal populations previously unknown. Whether those populations contain unusually large individuals remains undetectable by current eDNA methods, but confirming anaconda presence in ultra-remote locations would be a first step. The philosophical question underlying the search mirrors broader questions about wildness and proof. In an era of satellite surveillance, GPS tracking, and ubiquitous documentation, the existence of large animals without physical proof seems implausible. Yet the Amazon represents the final significant exception to total surveillance. Its size, its hostility to human presence, and its legal protections create conditions where the undocumented can persist. The absence of proof isn't proof of absence. It's merely evidence that the jungle keeps its secrets from those who lack permission or capability to intrude. Giant anacondas, if they exist, occupy a space beyond the reach of contemporary science, not because they're supernatural, but because they're simply elsewhere. And elsewhere, in the Amazon, means functionally infinite distance. Indigenous communities living at the boundaries of inaccessible regions maintain knowledge systems that Western science is only beginning to credit as valid data. When the Matses describe anacondas requiring multiple canoes to transport, when the Yanomami speak of serpents that alter river courses, when the Aparai differentiate between common water snakes and the ones that eat full-grown deer, these aren't legends or mistakes. They're observations by people who live in the ecosystem, who understand its patterns, whose survival depends on accurate knowledge of its dangers. The disconnect isn't between myth and reality. It's between two different forms of knowledge, one requiring physical specimens and repeatable observations, the other accepting oral testimony and accumulated wisdom. Giant anacondas exist in one system while remaining unconfirmed in the other. The 2023 discovery of a new primate species in the Amazon, the Schneider's marmoset, hiding in plain sight within a supposedly well-studied region, demonstrates that even relatively large vocal diurnal animals can avoid detection when they inhabit specific microhabitats. Anacondas are nocturnal, silent, aquatic, and perfectly camouflaged. They don't vocalize, don't build nests, don't leave obvious signs except occasional shed skins that decompose within weeks. A population of large anacondas in an unexplored tributary could exist for decades without producing a single piece of evidence detectable to external observers. The conditions required for their existence aren't exotic. They simply need water, prey, and absence of human interference. All three exist in abundance across millions of hectares of protected and inaccessible Amazon territory. The question isn't whether the Amazon could hide giant anacondas. The question is how many secrets like this remain, guarded by vegetation, distance, law, and the simple fact that the ecosystem is larger than human capacity to document it. The 16,000 kilometers of the Amazon River and its tributaries contain more water than any other river system on Earth, and over 1,100 of those tributaries have never been mapped. Blackwater tributaries create conditions where visibility extends inches, where an animal the size of a car could pass within meters of an observer and remain completely unseen. These aren't theoretical conditions. They define the dominant aquatic environment across millions of hectares of floodplain forest. When satellite imagery reveals a new species, it makes international headlines. When field researchers confirm what indigenous people have claimed for generations, it earns a footnote in specialized journals. The bias in what gets documented versus what gets believed creates a knowledge gap, shaped like credibility itself. Giant anacondas don't need to be mythical to remain unconfirmed. They simply need to live where confirmation is impossible. And the Amazon provides those conditions more thoroughly than any other ecosystem on Earth. The forest doesn't yield its mysteries to casual inquiry. It requires sustained presence, cultural permission, linguistic competency, local partnerships, and the acceptance that some places aren't meant for scientific instruments. Perhaps the giant anacondas exist in that space beyond proof, where indigenous knowledge meets physical reality in ways that don't require Western validation. Perhaps they swim through blackwater tributaries that will never see research boats, coil in flooded forests that will never be surveyed, hunt in the permanent darkness beneath triple canopy shade, where even satellite imagery reveals nothing. Perhaps they're simply elsewhere, and perhaps that's exactly where they should remain. The Amazon extends beyond the edge of complete human knowledge, and its remotest reaches remain functionally infinite. Every search that claims comprehensiveness has surveyed perhaps a fraction of a percent of the total territory. Every confident declaration about maximum possible sizes reflects our documented experience, not the upper limits of biological possibility. When indigenous guides point to certain tributaries and shake their heads, when they describe encounters with serpents that challenge their understanding of natural order, when they maintain that some rivers belong to creatures too large to be safely confronted, they're not embellishing, they're translating their reality into terms outsiders can barely comprehend. So when you hear accounts of anacondas exceeding recorded maximums, when expedition reports mention encounters quickly dismissed as misidentifications or exaggerations, when regional traditions describe serpents of impossible scale, consider the source less than the setting. The Amazon conceals what humans aren't meant to find, and sometimes revelation isn't discovery. Sometimes it's simply surviving long enough to tell the story. The giant anacondas, if they coil in the darkness of flooded forests, if they patrol blackwater tributaries too remote for boats, if they've grown to sizes that would rewrite herpetology textbooks, they exist beyond reach, not because they're impossible, but because the jungle has decided they should. If you're drawn to the places where science admits uncertainty, where maps dissolve into speculation, where the wilderness maintains dominion over documentation, then venture deeper with us into secrets of the Amazon jungle. Subscribe, and we'll trace every shadow the rainforest casts, every whisper it allows to escape, every mystery it guards beneath its living cathedral.